Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and first off, if you're wondering why the frame of today's video is different, I am currently cleaning my room and my bookshelves. And since my chair is usually right up against the bookshelves, I needed to move it a little bit so I can clean them and dust them off and everything. But now that we have that quick thing out of the way, today I want to once again talk about culture in fantasy. However, today is going to be a first in this little video series of mine, and that is because today we're not going to talk about culture in fantasy generally, but I instead want to look at a very specific aspect in a very specific series. And that aspect is colonization as well as slavery and also diaspora within the Stormlight Archive series by Brandon Sanderson. But before we get into that, I have noticed that in the past few weeks I've gotten quite a few new subscribers. I mean, compared to other booktubers, probably not a few, but like for my average, it's been quite a few. And so for those new subscribers, hi, hello, my name is Sarah and I have a bachelor's degree in social and cultural anthropology. And so I have decided to use what I have learned within social and cultural anthropology and try to use that to analyze culture within fantasy. And so, of course, today's topic isn't necessarily directly related to culture, although maybe a little bit, but it's still like colonialism, slavery, diaspora communities is something that is also a topic within cultural and social anthropology. And so yeah, that's why we're going to talk about this today. And right as I'm done with my intro, the battery is empty, so let me quickly change that. So battery is back. Also, I got myself some tea because it always is better to talk with a cup of tea in your hand. But anyway, today's video isn't going to be a full-on analysis, and there's two reasons for that. I mean, first of all, none of the videos I've done in this series so far were full-on analysis, and it was just me barfing out my thoughts. Even if those thoughts were thought through. But yeah, today I have specific reasons why this won't be an analysis. First of all, the reason is that I had exams in the past few weeks and I just didn't have the time to research. I currently, even if I don't have exams, don't exactly have a lot of time to research stuff for the series because, hi, hello, I study in a bachelor and in a master's degree, so yeah, not a lot of time left to research if I also want to spend some time just on reading, you know, and filming and all that other stuff. And then the second reason, however, is that I'm not even sure how useful it would be to do a properly researched video at this point in time. Because fact is, while we do know some aspects of the colonialism, the slavery, and so on within the Stormlight Archive series, I don't think we know enough yet about the history, how everything happened, why everything happened. I don't think we know enough yet about the listeners and the singers and so on to properly warrant a fully researched video. So what I thought, or what I wanted to do anyway in this video, is that the last time I reread Oathbringer as well as then read Rhythm of War for the first time, obviously, I had a lot of thoughts concerning those aspects of the story building, and I just thought I'd talk about those thoughts basically. And so yeah, that's what this video is going to be, and I think now we can finally get into it. Actually, not 100%, because I do want to tell you a spoiler warning at the very beginning. There are gonna be specific spoilers for Oathbringer, for one of the big reveals at the end, and there are gonna be, I'm not sure if there's gonna be explicit spoilers for Rhythm of War, but there are at least gonna be implicit spoilers for Rhythm of War. So yeah, if you wanna stay and watch this anyway, you're very welcome. But if not, then read the series first because it's amazing, and then come back and watch this video because it's still gonna be here. You just need a few like weeks or something to read the 4 books. It's not like it's 4,000 plus page tomes. So let's start with the first of the 3 words that I mentioned, colonialism. And here I think it's something very interesting, because when I think of colonialism, of what I learned about colonialism, within social and cultural anthropology, of course, I learned mostly about colonialism that started with, you know, British imperialism, Spanish colonialism, French colonialism, what we usually think of as colonialism right now, where you have an original country and that country like sends their settlers somewhere to control a part of land or to take ownership of a part of land somewhere else, and mostly also control the population there. However, I also remember in school, and you know, it's 10 years past, I might be a bit wrong there, but I also remember in school that, for example, when it came to like Greek colonies, a lot of time the goal wasn't necessarily to control another people somewhere else, but it was just that maybe you had a shortage of food in the original place, and so the city-states sent a bunch of people somewhere else to build a settlement there and to start a colony there. But what both of these have in common is that you do have your original place, and you have a connection between the colonies and the original place. And I mean, sometimes that connection is cut, like in the American War of Independence, but again, there's usually a fight for independence if you want to cut the connection in the colonies. And even in a lot of cases, for example, where independence was gained, for example, let's think of French colonies within Africa, there's still a connection to this day, whether it is forced or because they wanted like that, a connection is there. However, within Roshar, no one really set out to colonize somewhere else. What we know of the history is that a few millennia ago, humans came to Roshar, which, by the way, this is what I'm talking about, if it wasn't clear. Talking about the humans colonizing the singers and listeners. And I'll get to the singers and listeners later. But basically, humans didn't set out to, you know, colonize anyone, but it was just that they destroyed their home place, so they had to flee. That's what we know so far. And the singers were nice enough to be like, yeah, there's a bit of land over there in Shinovar, so, you know, you can settle there. And we don't know what happened in between. We have no clue what happened in between. We just know that with the first desolation, the humans were seen as the void bringers by the singers, and then afterwards at some point the narrative completely turned and singers became the void bringers, and humans suddenly were thought to be the main people of Roshar. And by the way, this is the perfect example of, while I do think and I do wanna at some point in the future, once we have more information, properly put in work to analyze these aspects of the Stormlight archive, I just don't think at the moment there's enough there's enough information to properly analyze it, because how can we analyze the colonialism or the humans colonizing and starting to control the singers if we don't even know what exactly happened? And yeah, so that's the first part, the colonization of Roshar, that I find very, very interesting, and that I hope we'll get a lot more information in the future. But also that to a certain point was one of my, I said it in my review, I said it in my vlogs, one of my main criticisms of Rhythm of War, that we had this big revelation at the end of Oathbringer, this kind of bomb that just was dropped on us, that then was not talked about at all within Rhythm of War. And it felt like, you know, none of the characters were interested. Like, okay, we now know that we started out just being refugees within Roshar, but how did we end up where we are now? And I think it's something that's certainly gonna have to be discussed within the Stormlight archive between the characters. And I think it's also one of the main things that I see about the Stormlight archive that I can see kind of as potentially problematic. Because, you know, you have these people who were peaceful. I mean, we don't know that much about the culture. We don't know if they were actually a peaceful folk, if they had war in between each other or whatever, but who like did their own thing basically. And you had humans coming in as refugees and then taking over. And I think the framing around that and the framing around what the humans did, who the humans are, can they be held responsible after millennia of like living there for what their ancestors did and like not even knowing anymore what their ancestors did, can they still be held responsible? And I think those are discussions that need to be had within the Stormlight archive, but also maybe within the fandom. And I think depending on how the framing is at the end, there's some stuff that can potentially be criticized pretty harshly. Because, and let's just say it as it is, I have talked about this a lot within the series already, but there's a certain problem within fantasy when it comes to colonial narratives. And of course, the most obvious example is The Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin, where you have Daenerys and her colonial narrative. But yeah, so I'm gonna be very interested to see where it goes. And yeah, we'll see. Then the second thing I wanted to talk about was slavery within the Stormlight archive. The first is that I feel like there's two different types of slavery within the Stormlight archive. I mean, I don't know a lot about slavery. I basically know that there's different types of slavery, of which the worst is seen as like chattel slavery, which was the slavery that, you know, the transatlantic trade was a part of, and that was the black slaves within North America basically. But also I think South America had a lot of that, and just, you know, the transatlantic trade. But then you also have types of slavery where slavery is maybe a punishment, or part of a punishment, kind of. You know, the American modern prison system still does slavery. Is that the proper way to say it? I forgot the word right now, but you probably know what I mean. Where, I mean, technically you're working for a wage, but that wage is like so minuscule that it basically doesn't matter. Also, this whole thing that slavery is still legal within the American Constitution, just as a punishment. So, you know, that's always very interesting. But then you also have indebted types of servitude where you then can be put into slavery, which I think, if I remember correctly, you know, first of all, that still happened in the Middle Ages, I think, in Europe. And also, I believe Rome often was part of that, or like had a system of slavery like that, where a lot of times if you were poorer and you owed someone a lot of money, you then were turned into a slave for them. I hope that makes sense. And then also, of course, there's types of slavery where a lot of times slaves were one of the spoils of war, where if you were a losing country or a losing nation or a losing culture within a war, often your people were then enslaved. And so I think that maybe saying there's two types of slavery within the Stormlight archive is wrong to say, but I think there needs to be a distinction made between humans who are enslaved as well as singers or listeners that were enslaved, which of course were known as parshmen. And once again, we don't really have enough information to properly analyze it. And by the way, the lack of information is both in terms of the slaves that are humans as well as the slaves that were singers. And for the humans, let's start with the humans. I at first would assume that like the slavery when it comes to humans is more along the lines of forced labor or like indebted servitude, because I don't know, I feel like most of the humans who are slaves either were slaves because they were like, you know, part of the enemy faction, whatever, bad luck in the case of Kaladin, maybe crimes, slavery as a punishment, and so on. But then I thought about it, and you know what? I feel like there's one big information missing about the slavery of humans, and that is, are children born into slavery? Like, you have two slaves, they get a child, is their child gonna automatically be a slave as well? And I feel like that's kind of important to know. I mean, slavery is bad in any case, so like, it's not important to know from a morality standpoint, but I think it would be interesting to know, to maybe be able to analyze the slavery within the Stormlight archive more closely. But then gotta be honest, the reason why I feel like the human slavery is more along the lines of indentured servitude within the Stormlight archive is because we do know that slaves, at least the bridgemen, which you know, is the one group of people that we actually follow who are slaves, are paid a wage. I mean, it's so minuscule that it basically doesn't matter whatsoever that they get a wage. It's not like they're ever gonna get enough money with that to buy their freedom. I mean, they technically could, but not gonna happen. But then again, prison labor within the US also pays a wage, and that wage is minuscule. So, but you know, that's why I feel like the parallels in terms of what type of slavery it is are more along those lines of prison labor within the US rather than, you know, the chattel slavery of the transatlantic trade route. And that actually brings me to the Parshmen, as they were known as slaves. And I don't know, I don't feel quite comfortable pulling the parallels between the way the Parshmen are enslaved as well as chattel slavery, because chattel slavery and the slavery that was a result of the transatlantic trade route is of course one of the worst, and I cannot stress this enough, like, atrocities that humanity has ever done. And you know, the only thing that we really knew about the slavery, or that we know at this point of the slavery of the singers, or not the slavery of the singers, the enslavement of the singers, is that they're born into slavery and also that they are the property of whoever owns them, which I feel isn't quite the case with, you know, the human slavery within the Stormlight. However, that is really all we know about how the singers were treated as slaves. We do not know if they were treated badly. We do not know if they were treated well. I mean, you know, that's still secondary to their property, because that's one of the stupidest arguments ever that, like, I sometimes still see people make, that somehow people still make somehow, when it's like, yeah, but the slaves were treated well. Yeah, so what? They were still property. And I mean, of course, good for the people owning the slaves that they treat them well, but you know, that's, I feel like that's still a secondary argument. But anyway, back to the Parshendi. Those two things, like that they're property and that they're born into slavery, are really the only two things we know. And I find that very interesting, and I also think it's kind of a purposeful decision. First of all, we don't know how it happened and when it happened that Parshmen were turned into slaves for humans. Like, was it something that was already there before the latest desolation? Was it just something that happened following the latest desolation, and so on? And then also, I think it's very purposeful that we never see how anyone treats their Parshmen. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that not a single character we ever see interacting with a singer as a Parshman, as a slave, aside from Bridge 4 with Relaine. And that's like not gonna be an example for how the singers were treated. And I think that's a very interesting and very purposeful decision. We also never see how human slaves are treated outside of Bridge 4, and that's more like an example for Zedeas. You know, it's supposed to show how horrible Zedeas is and how little he thinks of human life. But, you know, is it really just an example for Zedeas, or is it just that human slaves are also not seen as like their own people and are just seen as property? And I think it was done very purposefully, because we know slavery is normal in Alethkar. We know that, like, you know, Adolin, Dalinar, Shallan, we know that those people probably owned slaves. And I think it would be very hard to like those characters if we saw them interacting with their slaves, like on a level where it's, you know, whatever, they're slaves, of course, like this is normal. And so yeah, I just thought about this after finishing Rhythm of War, and I found it very interesting. And also, I need to rant once again about Dalinar, because oh my god. Oh my god, I hate this man so much. So much. Just absolutely hate him. Like in the first book, he's supposed to be morally superior to Sadeas because he doesn't use bridgemen to, you know, cross the chasms. And like, I was caught in that as well. I was like, yeah, he's better than Sadeas. I mean, he is kind of, but also I prefer Sadeas because Sadeas at least knows he's an asshole, and Dalinar still, you know, pretends to be a nice guy. And so he had a problem with sending the bridgemen to die, but he never had a problem with slavery, you know, which got very obvious within the last book. I couldn't find the scene right now, I wanted to look it up again, but you know, when Yasna wanted to abolish slavery and he's like, no, we can't. And his argument wasn't even, you know, the economic argument, which still isn't a good argument because you're talking about human lives, and you know, human lives go like are more important than economics. But at the same time, it is also true that in almost all, if not all, systems where slavery was a thing, slavery was one of the basics of economic wealth of the nation, of the country. Like, again, thinking back to 10 years ago when I learned about ancient Rome, I'm pretty sure that like more than 50% of their economics was based on slavery. And so if you abolish it overnight, that's gonna be a big economic crash. And so even if I think it's still a shitty argument, I would have on some level accepted the argument by Dalinar if he was like, you know, we've lost all of the parshmen, which probably also were a big part of the economics. We can't just also abolish slavery in general, or like enslavement of humans overnight, because our economics would be fucked up, which, you know, they probably are anyway. But no, his argument was tradition. You cannot change tradition. And so, yeah, that was the moment where he went from a character where I'm like, I don't really like you, but you're an interesting character, you know, with your backstory and trying to do better. But yeah, that just kind of... I hate Dalinar so much. I hate him so much. But yeah, those were kind of my thoughts I had on the topic of slavery within the Stormlight Archive. And once again, as I said, there's not really enough there to properly analyze. I can think about it a lot, but I don't think I can come to specific conclusions yet. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about, which is the one thing where I'm not like, you know, there's kind of a potential there for maybe being problematic, is kind of the interactions of diaspora communities with the original community. And that's something that I actually only like studied a little bit, like very surface level, I think last semester, or like the last semester of my bachelor's, because I did a lecture on the Caribbean and the anthropology, like anthropological stuff in the Caribbean. And so I found a lot of parallels between diasporic communities today in our world and what I learned about them, and then also the singers, listeners, parshmen, former parshmen within the Stormlight Archive. And something that I especially found very interesting is that a lot of times when it comes to diasporic communities and the communities they originated from, I don't want to say original communities because that kind of implies that diasporic communities aren't original. But, you know, there's a lot of conflict a lot of times because the communities they originated from feel like they're original, and, you know, diasporic communities lost their culture and whatever, not considering why those communities lost their culture. And so once again, going back to the most obvious example of the transatlantic slave trade, where you had black people who were brought from Africa and brought to other places and who were told to completely lose their culture, who were punished if they showed like anything that would connect them or continue to connect them to their culture. And those people a lot of times lost the culture that they came from. And of course, in the first generation or maybe first 2 generations of enslaved people, the loss of culture wasn't as bad. And a lot of times, especially in the Caribbean, you had runaway slaves that then built their own communities, or that were slaves that, like, if a ship was shipwrecked, you had a lot of communities of the slaves that were able to run away then and to build their own communities, and who were still able to keep a lot from the culture that they originated from. However, the longer you go, the more generations you have, of course, the more you lose. And the way you keep stuff a lot of times is by merging it with new stuff, by merging it with cultures you learn from your owners, basically, to learn from your, not owners, slavers. And then of course you come to modern diasporic cultures post-slavery, which a lot of times are a mixture of elements, which have elements of the originated from cultures, which have elements of cultures that are very specific and very connected to the experience as enslaved people. And then you have elements that were taken over from the people who enslaved them. And so you have a whole mixture, and then you sometimes get clashes between the cultures that see themselves as original and those cultures trying to tell the people who had their own experiences, who are now very much their own culture, trying to tell them what they're doing wrong and what they lost and how they now should be. And I kind of see that a little bit within the former parshmen, as well as the singers, as well as the listeners within the Stormlight archive. I mean, we don't really know yet if the singers and listeners are different communities from the same culture, or if they're more along the lines of different ethnicities. But especially in book 3 and 4, in Oathbringer as well as in Rhythm of War, you have this discussion of, you know, the former parshmen. And I find it very interesting because, I mean, when we talk, for example, about the transatlantic slave trade, it took how long? Like 2, maybe 3 generations to have your originated from heritage almost completely erased. And yet the parshmen were enslaved for, or the singers were enslaved for how long? 4 millennia, I think. So I just found the discussions really interesting of the parshmen that were like, I don't know where I come from. My only culture is the culture of the people who oppressed and enslaved me for thousands of years. And also when you had those conflicts where you had to teach the former parshmen again to, you know, attune to the rhythms because they did not know the rhythms. And also the question that I asked myself is, you know, is that necessary? Is it necessary to force them to accept the culture they are originated from? Wouldn't it be, you know, more proper to let them find their own way, and let them find their own way, maybe back to their heritage, maybe like syncretize and combine elements from how you grew up because of your experience, as well as finding yourself, finding your heritage again. And so yeah, I just found those discussions around that very interesting. And also just the way the singers almost regard the parshmen or the former parshmen with kind of pity, which, you know, is also part of the conflict between originated from as well as diasporic groups. And yeah, those are just some elements that gave me a lot of thought and made me pause a lot, and that I very much enjoyed. And I very much want to see more of the interactions between singers, listeners and former parshmen within the Stormlight archive. And I hope at some point we're gonna get more of a focus on that, because like there was some good stuff. But anyway, I hope this video was once again not too rambly. I'm now gonna sit down and edit this. It's probably way too long. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. Tell me in the comments down below what your thoughts on these topics are. Again, I might have gotten some things wrong because I didn't have time to research some of the things, so a lot of it is just from memory. And yeah, all the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. All the links to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where I read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman per month, are also in the description box down below, so go and check those out as well if you're interested. In February we're gonna read Empress of Salt and Fortune. And yeah, with that said, I think that was it, and bye.